Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Kylee Cast. I'm Kylee Griswold, managing editor at the Federalist. Please like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We have a new channel specifically for the Kylee Cast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So if you are only subscribed to the Federalist Radio Hour or You're Wrong with Molly Hemingway and David Harsani, two of our other great Federalist podcasts, be sure to subscribe to the Kylee Cast as well so you never miss an episode. Leave us a 5-star review. It is truly one of the easiest and best ways you can help out the show. And even better yet, if you are just listening to the show, go check out the full video version on my personal YouTube channel or the Federalist channel on Rumble. And then, of course, like and subscribe there too. If you'd like to email the show, you can do so at radio@thefederalist.com. I would love to hear from you. Today, I am so excited to welcome to the show Dr. Carrie Gress. Carrie is a wife, a homeschooling mother of 5. She's a senior contributor to The Federalist, and she is the founder and editor of Theology of Home, and she's the author of 10 books, most recently, Something Wicked: Why Feminism Can't Be Fused with Christianity. It is such a good read, and I feel at this point compelled to offer a trigger warning for our conversation because it's such a hot topic. Carrie and I dive into the origins of feminism and why first wave feminism is actually just as destructive as the subsequent waves, as well as what feminism even is and how it's harmed Christian marriages, and how women who are Christians but have been seduced by feminism can get out of the feminism cult and reclaim a biblical worldview of womanhood. That and so much more. Without further ado, please welcome to the show, Carrie Gress. Carrie Gress, it is so great to have you on the Kylee Cast. Thank you for joining me today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
I have been chomping at the bit to talk to you about this book ever since I heard about it, and then after reading about it even more so. It's such an important topic, and I just can't wait for more people to read it and to learn about it. So why don't, before we dive into the themes of the book, why don't you just tell listeners a little bit about yourself and how you came to write this book?
Yeah, so I am a mother of 5. I have a PhD in philosophy, and when I was doing that PhD, I said out loud to God that I would never write on women's issues. And here we are, 11 books in, and I think most of them have been related to women's issues. So,
Yeah,
God,
you should never do that.
no, don't do it. Exactly, it always backfires. The same thing happened actually when I met my husband. I met him and thought the poor woman that has to marry this guy, and ended up marrying him. So God has a great sense of humor. But in any event, yeah. So I about 10 years ago, I wrote my first book, kind of just really starting to scrutinize feminism, and that book came out in 2018. It was called The Anti-Mary Exposed: Rescuing the Culture from Toxic Femininity. And, really at that point, nobody was talking about this, about feminism as an issue. And so it's kind of an outlier. And, but the book did well. And I had all these people say, can you write a book that would be more secular friendly or Protestant friendly? And, I was totally up for that because I thought that the themes were very universal and were not specific just to Catholics. And so I then wrote another book called The End of Woman, and that came out with Regnery in 2023. And that was great. It's sort of it did well. And it was just kind of a philosophical walk through, the foundations of feminism and how we got from feminism to the trans movement and kind of all the pieces in between. And then finally, I realized, I haven't put the nail in the coffin yet. I haven't made it clear that feminism and Christianity really are from totally different DNA. They have different roots entirely. And we just as Christians need to stop trying to make the two work, because it's creating a lot of damage. It's creating a lot of confusion more than anything. And I think that Christians in general just don't know what's good and what's bad and what parts we can keep and what parts we can't. And so that was really the goal with this book, was to just finally add a lot of clarity and just say, look, these are two very distinct, philosophical groups. Feminism was actually set up to undermine and to get rid of Christianity. And, we needed to stop trying to make the two work together.
Yes. In the book, you include so much fascinating history, and I was especially captivated by your section on first wave feminism. And
Mm.
it kind of took me back mentally to a big project I did in college. It was my capstone project on the transgender revolution. And that was
Mm.
before it became quite the flashpoint that it is now.
Yeah.
But in my research, I mean, it took me directly back to second wave feminism. I mean, there's a direct line between Betty Friedan and Bella Abzug and their work, and Simone de
Yeah.
Beauvoir and the trans
Mhm.
movement, and the way that they talked
Mhm.
about being beyond gender and not
Right.
being born a woman but becoming one, and all these things.
Yeah.
But I think so that made sense to me, like why second wave feminism was so evil and so subversive.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
but I think subconsciously I believed the lie that first wave feminism was okay because here are these noble goals, this was
Mhm.
necessary, but second wave feminism wasn't. And
Mhm.
diving especially into that first few chapters of your book where you really get into the nasty origins of first wave feminism really opened my eyes even more to
Yeah.
some of these issues. So can you just kind of a 30,000 foot view, because I think we could talk about this for a full hour, but just kind of why the first wave was just as bad as the second and third wave.
Yeah. So the first wave, I bought the lie as well. And actually, when I wrote my book, The End of Woman, I thought, okay, I've got 2 days to research the first wave. I'll just find some nice quotes and then I'll move back to the second wave. And, I'm still in the first wave. I haven't been able to leave it yet. It's just there's so much. And I keep digging and finding more. And that for this book, for Something Wicked, what really became super abundantly clear was just the idea of how much the first wave was really built on disordered theological ideas.
Mm,
Mary Wollstonecraft actually was she had migrated in her faith from Anglicanism to then dissenting Christian, and then on to Unitarianism, which doesn't believe in the Trinity, it doesn't believe in the
mhm,
divinity of Christ. And she actually makes the point that any kind of male mediator, and she's here talking about both pastors and priests and Jesus himself, is a block or an obstacle to a woman's potential to have a
mm,
relationship or be in relationship with God. So she makes that very clear, and then you can see as the movement moves forward, it jumps across the pond over back to the United States. But all of those early first wave feminists, from Lucretia Mott and Fanny Wright's another one that people are coming to know, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Matilda Gage, on and on. They almost all of them were both became Unitarians, so they left, Calvinism and being Baptists to anything mainline. They left for Unitarianism.
mm,
And then most of them also dabbled in the occult and were very involved in what was called spiritualism, which was, seances and knocking on tables and all kinds of things. And that's actually where Elizabeth Cady Stanton had the idea for the Seneca Falls Convention in the first place, was at one of those spirit tables, which is now in the Smithsonian here in Washington. So yeah, it's pretty amazing when you start looking at it. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony in particular, their newspaper was called The Revolution, and they very specifically were targeting Christianity, and they believed that it was a tool being used by men to enslave women, and they compared women's lives to those of slaves. And they're very explicit about this kind of overlap, which is audacious when you actually look at who these women were and how privileged they were.
mhm,
They're making this effort to compare themselves to slaves before the Civil War. It's really amazing. So that's kind of the nest of it, or the essence of
mhm,
it. And then even things like suffrage was important, but it was just more what it seemed seemingly was more important was this idea of transforming the understanding of womanhood into something very masculine,
mhm.
trying to help women believe that they would be happier the more they became like men, and that they had to just get rid of the shackles of Christianity, and that then they would be liberated from it. So that's
Mhm.
kind of the big picture, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Oh my goodness. There's so much to unpack in what you just said. And I mean, of course, as we've seen since then, there is no limiting principle to becoming more like men. I mean, first
Yeah,
it's
right,
unshackling yourself, then then we see the introduction of the pill, like way later, of course.
right.
That makes women more like men. And then abortion makes women more like men. And then, oh, you can just actually become a man, actually.
Yeah,
You're
right.
not actually confined to your womanhood. I mean, there is no
Yeah.
logical endpoint. It's so destructive. Um,
Mhm.
I also think it's so interesting that so many of these first wave feminists did have religious roots, that they did actually
Mhm.
have some theological understanding or backing.
Yeah.
Because it strikes me that this was almost, early deconstructionism. And it's
Yeah.
so interesting because, all over Instagram, and maybe it's just my algorithm or the type of people that I follow, but it seems to me that there is a huge overlap. The Venn diagram mostly a circle here of
Mhm.
women who have bought into feminism and
Mhm.
women who have deconstructed from Christianity. And of course, there's
Mhm.
still a lot of women who claim to be Christians and I think faithful Christians who don't know that they've been deceived by feminism and would also identify as feminists. But I think there's also a large segment of women who do have um, who do have a religious background, but were maybe poorly
Yeah.
catechized, whether they're Catholic or Protestant, and have fallen for feminism. And that feminism
Mhm.
has deconstructed the weak faith that they did
Mhm.
have.
Yeah.
And it's just interesting that you even see this in the first wave, um,
Mhm.
because
Yeah.
clearly that's what happened to the
Right.
architects of feminism.
Right. No, and that was one of the things that was really fascinating to see was just these loops that, these cycles that we go through. And so very explicitly, I was seeing, what were happening among Protestants in particular, kind of this engagement with the occult, whether it's enneagrams or, just manifesting and various things that are popping up. All of those things happen in the 1800s. And I think, the first thing we have to do in understanding this is sort of get rid of this sense that we have of this very Victorian prim and proper era,
Mhm.
but really recognize that there was something very radical going on during this period. And even Percy Shelley, who is, it seems like a totally random person, but he's, English poet who created this woman named Sithna that became the model for what feminism became. She's these three pieces. One of them was Contempt for Men, which came from Shelley's mother-in-law, Mary Wollstonecraft. From his father-in-law, he got the idea of what they called free love or the end of monogamy. His father-in-law, William Godwin, thought that marriage was a kind of slavery, and he
Mhm.
later went on to influence Marx significantly. And then Shelley added his own fascination with the occult. But he also said, way back then, this is like early 1800s, said we, eventually we'll get rid of this construct called gender or sexuality. I'm not exactly sure what language he
Mhm.
used, but that was kind of the idea was that he saw that this was something that we just needed to rid ourselves of. And so it's interesting to see, he's saying this well over 200 years ago. And now
Right.
if you look at feminism today, what is it? It's contempt for men, it's promiscuity, and it's the occult. So not everybody obviously is involved in all three of those things, but you can see how once you are, those things really do enslave you into this kind of you know this new slavery, I think, of use and denigration that we
Mhm.
really are seeing around us now. It's very hard to uphold the ordered dignity of a person when those pieces are really at play, and that the isolation that comes with them and whatnot. So
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
amazing to see the patterns, I think.
Yeah, and just that those seeds were present from the very beginning. Again,
Yeah,
that this wasn't something that started as an innocent thing that kind of snowballed out of control. It's this
right.
this was the point the whole
Very
time.
interesting. Yeah.
Yes, and there's nothing new under the sun here. This is a
Right.
total sidebar, but I also found it so interesting as I was reading this first wave history because I took literature classes in college, specifically British literature, and it was so funny to see that there's just these two parallel tracks. Like I knew of a lot of these characters, but I didn't know of them as being so adjacent to first wave feminism.
Wow.
I just knew of their writing, the
Yeah.
Shelleys and all of them, and then seeing how they
Mhm.
fit into Mary Wollstone. I don't know how to say her name,
Wollstonecraft.
Wollstonecraft.
Mhm.
Um, was just very fascinating. I'm like, "Oh, wow, there's way more to probe here than I had any idea when I was superficially studying these authors in college." So,
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah. No, I
Um,
think you're exactly right.
maybe we should have started here, but how do you define feminism? Because I know everybody has a different idea of what it is. So
Sure.
so what do you think it is?
So I think feminism, what we're not talking about is just this general idea that feminism is about helping women. I think this has been kind of a blob definition that
Mhm,
feminism has
yes.
tried to use and has really stuck under the radar because of it. It says, well, if you don't like feminism, you must not want to help women, or it's evaded scrutiny. And I think very specifically looking at what's happened with feminism and the movement and the whole trajectory. Feminism really is about creating autonomy for women, for for women as something of an idol, that's really the goal of a woman's life, is to be autonomous from from husbands and children, to have her own career and sort of basically dictate the way that her life looks, that she's sort of the one behind the controls, instead of being deeply embedded in relationships and whatnot. And then in addition to that, I have all these other pieces, and this is really where the book came from, kind of this idea of recognizing that feminism is this shadow church, is because I think feminism has mimics a lot of the things that you see in Christianity. So it has this, we have an object of worship in Christianity, which is God, and feminism has this idol of woman's autonomy. And then from there, you go to the different commandments that it's got, which are what I just discussed: the contempt for men, the promiscuity, and the involvement in the occult. It's got its own sacrament, which is abortion. It's got its own form of evangelization, which is certainly, broken women break other people around them. And we see that in spades. And then it becomes much more easy to become a feminist because of the bitterness and whatnot that's sown in it. And then another extraneous piece of it, but I think is really important, is the emotional level. Christianity has faith, hope, and love. And feminism has contempt, rage, and envy are really the emotions that it really is trying to promote in women. And that's certainly not by accident either. That goes back to the early 1890s, when the socialists realized that women are a lot more politically active and engaged when they're angry. So anyway, that's kind of the fabric of it. And that's what I talk about in the book itself, are all these different pieces that you see that kind of line up as imitating Christianity.
Yeah. I think it is interesting that, this kind of blob definition is so easy to get behind. I think that's
Yeah.
why so many women fall for it, is, it's just because to oppose feminism is just to oppose womankind. if you
Right.
believe the modern conception of the definition of feminism. And it is just so interesting that the feminists have not only defined their own movement wrongly, but they've also defined what being an anti-feminist is wrongly as well.
Yeah.
They kind of hold all the definitions, and it's hard, because the definitions are so vague
Right.
to oppose feminism, because again, it's such a flowery, vague definition, and
Yeah.
hard to oppose something that sounds so noble and so wonderful.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and then it adds on the, certain people aren't allowed to talk about it. Like men can't talk about it because they're
right.
not women. And then I'm not supposed to talk about it because I have a PhD. It sort of becomes like this mommy dearest relationship. Like, you've benefited from feminism, therefore we can't talk about it, which nobody would accept that when it comes to any kind of religion. Like, oh, you've benefited from Christianity, therefore you can't scrutinize it. Like that's ridiculous. No secular person, or no one who would consider themselves a feminist would actually allow that to happen in that case. So why is it that somehow this is protected entity,
Right.
that we can't look behind the curtain at what's really going on behind it and see, is this really good? And I think it's because so much of it is really bad that it's worked hard to hide it from the general population.
You touched on autonomy when you talked about the
Mhm.
three commandments of feminism.
Mhm.
Can you, in the book, you write that autonomy is both a lie and an idol. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah. So autonomy is fascinating because one of the things that you see, first way feminism, for all of its faults, you've got all these women who are with the best of intention trying to protect other women. The irony is, of course, that all the efforts that they've made to try to protect women have not actually worked. So, for example, if you look at who Mary Wollstonecraft is trying to protect, it's her sister and her best friend and the relationships they were involved in. We still see the exact same kind of abuse in women, only it's much, much worse, especially if you include, human trafficking and all the other realities, awful realities that we're seeing today. In the world. So there's this effort at trying to sort of bubble wrap women, that if we don't have these relationships with men or with children, and we're just really focused on our own, career and focus, then we're not going to be vulnerable. But of course, that's the lie, because you're still vulnerable. It just comes in different stages. And, this is part of being human, is that idea of being in relationship with others and loving others and self-gift. And, the tragedy is, of course, that so many women buy into this. And then it's not until they're, 50s, 60s that they realize, like, okay, this lie about my fertility was a total lie, and now I'm alone, and this is not
Right.
at all what I wanted my life to look like. So I think that's the big lie. But the thing that's so compelling about it is this idea of autonomy is appealing because you don't have to wait for a man to ask you on a date. You don't have to wait for someone to propose to you. It's everything is really about your own control and power and what it is that you want. And the career certainly is the goal of this elusive goal of having this incredible career and being very fulfilled by that. But I think obviously there are problems with that as an idol, because that's never going to satisfy you,
Mm.
especially because we become so insular and self gazing. And we know through Christianity that joy really comes from self gift and giving of
Mhm.
ourselves to others and uniting ourselves with God's will, instead of it being all our will. So I think that those are, all of these things are problematic, because it's questing after something that's a much lower good than what it is that we're meant to really be seeking. And sadly, of course, our economic system is really built around this. You've got medical schools and law schools promoting the idea of freezing eggs, and women that you can just put off motherhood until you're ready for it. And these things too are just laden with lies, because of course women's fertility isn't a switch that can be flipped on and off at will, but it,
Mhm.
has its own path and course, and um, you know, and levels off, steeply after a certain age. So, yeah, I think that's the real issue, is just trying to see past this, that this really is about, being seduced into an idea of what it is that's best for us, instead of what's fundamentally really is the best thing for women.
Yeah. It's interesting that okay, so I wonder if that is why IVF specifically can be so seductive for
Mm,
Christians or for people who
yeah,
would carry the, label of pro-life but are,
right.
you know, deceived into thinking that IVF is pro-life rather than what it is, which is, part of big fertility. It's actually horrible for women. It's
Mhm,
deadly for children. Um,
mhm, mhm.
because you're not fully scorning motherhood. You are just trying to have your cake and eat it too. It's like
Yeah.
trying to value human life, trying to value motherhood, but also trying to live out the lie of autonomy and the idol of autonomy of I
Mhm.
can have my career, I can pursue the things that I want to pursue. I'm not shackled
Yeah.
by my fertility. I'm not shackled by,
Mhm.
a single motherhood or a stay-at-home motherhood life in the home. But I
Right.
can I can still hold these two things that are kind of contradictory of motherhood and the feminist ideal
Yeah.
simultaneously, while also convincing myself IVF is a pro-life and Christian position. And
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of that till just now, but it really seems like maybe one way that the enemy
Mhm.
can deceive women into thinking that
Mhm.
they can be both feminists and Christians and also pro-life while supporting these practices that are inherently neither Christian nor pro-life.
Yeah. No, I think that's an amazing point, because you just connected a lot of really interesting dots that I hadn't really thought about. But I think that what you've just described is what we're seeing, especially among conservative feminists and Catholic feminists in particular, is kind of this cake and eat it too attitude, where it can be, I can still do all these things that I want to do, and without having to give anything up. And the reality is that that's the big problem, is that we have been seduced and told, and even the whole culture reflects this idea of having it all and being able to do it all, and there's no sacrifice at any point. But we
Mhm.
know that order, beauty, love, all of these things are actually built on sacrifice. And obviously this is the beauty of a woman having many seasons of her life, and being able to learn what needs to happen at what season. That's really important. But instead we've prioritized kind of this goal of like the career, and still wanting to be the stay-at-home mom. But it's in the end of it, and actually I wrote a piece about this for the Federalist, is this idea of kind of this girl math of, you can't do both a full-time mom and the full-time career without something giving.
Yeah.
And sadly, what we have seen give are the children. And I think IVF is just another, piece, even earlier, at an earlier stage, of where we're expecting children to sort of accommodate us instead of the other way around. So yeah, I
Mhm.
really like the way that you articulated that.
The self-sacrifice point is such a good point too, because I think one thing that I've heard from self-described feminist Christians is
Mhm.
just this idea of Jesus as a liberator. And of course, in some ways we know that that is true in the sense that he frees
Right.
us from our sins. Like he liberates us in some ways. But
Yeah.
just sort of going back to the basics of what we know about the character of Christ as
Mhm.
not somebody who liberates us to self-actualization, but rather
Right.
to self-denial. Like he
Yeah.
is the
Right.
epitome of self-sacrifice. That's the whole point of the gospel, is that he came to actually lay down his life for the good of
Mhm.
others. And just this idea
Right.
that the feminist ideal of I can have it all and I can determine my destiny, and I can
Mhm.
live out my dream even if it requires putting my family and other people around me on the back burner. It's so anti the character of Christ.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
we can co-opt feminist language and sort of try to marry it to Jesus speak, but it just
Yeah.
doesn't work because that's just not who the savior is.
Yeah.
And so it's so
No.
important to help get women out of these patterns of thinking that are just really, really anti-biblical.
Yeah, no, I think that is such a great point too. One of the books that I used for my research was this book called Satanic Feminism, and when I first read this book, it's published by Oxford University Press, very academic. It was a dissertation, and for whatever reason, I don't know why, I never looked at the subtitle of the book, and I just assumed that this guy was against feminism because with a name like Satanic Feminism, you would think that who would be for that? But the subtitle of the book is basically how Lucifer liberated women. That's the subtitle of the book, and so it's really interesting because he's, of course, using it's really an awful book, but the research is amazing and was incredibly helpful, especially my book, The End of Woman. But that's the amazing thing is just this: what does that word liberate mean, and what is it playing out? And so, if you go back to the first wave, what they mean by liberation is freedom from husband and Christianity. That's exactly what they mean. They don't
Mhm.
mean, that this sort of contorted way of, no more sacrificing. They mean the exact opposite of that. And that really is, I think, what you're right. Christ calls us to is this life of following him, of emptying ourselves out for others. And that's really where we're going to find joy and happiness, and we're going to find just the beauty of complementarity of male and female, going back to Genesis, which is a whole other layer of things that have been distorted by the feminists in the first wave in particular, is this idea of who Eve was and, and what she represented. So anyway, yeah, I think these are really important terms that we need to understand deeply who the person of Christ was and what it is that we're meant to follow, instead of just having this expectation that really it's an entitlement. It's a sense of
Mhm.
entitlement that we're somehow owed things, instead of offering things.
Yeah. You bring up Genesis, and that was one thing that struck me. I think you bring it up multiple times in the book about just the Satan's tactic of going after the woman and how that worked in the garden and how that has just continued throughout all time. That you I forget how you phrase it. Maybe you can articulate it better, but just
Mhm.
the way that you can crumble so many things by like captivating women and catching them in
Yeah.
this sin, and the way that it's just destroyed everyone, not just women.
Right, right. Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. There's something about womanhood, where men will follow what it is that women do. We see that with Eve, and so you better get your women right. And this is, the tragedy of what feminism has done, is because it has silenced men so broadly. It's just amazing to hear the crickets. And there's so many men I hear privately all the time who don't like feminism, who don't want feminism. And there are certainly a few that are speaking up, and the voices are getting louder and stronger and more numerous. Thanks be to God. But
Mhm.
for, how many, we're in like the sixth decade of this, and it's taken a very long time. I think, for that realization. And, we had to get to this point where it's just so obvious to see what the damage is. And so people are feeling a lot more comfortable, I think, talking up or speaking up about it. But absolutely, I think that Fulton Sheen had this amazing line about how you can measure a culture by the level of its women, because women are typically meant to be something that men aspire to be worthy of.
Mm.
So when you have women who are not aspiring to anything worthy, in fact, it's very difficult to even define what a good woman is in the culture today. There's nothing for them to aspire to. There's nothing for them to really have to become better men in order to be attractive and something that woman feels like is worth attaching herself to.
Mhm.
And so I think this is one of the reasons why we're seeing so many problems. The constant complaint, there's no men out there. Well,
Mhm.
what have we done with women? It sort of feels like, in many respects, sort of this race to the bottom of like which sex can behave worse,
Mhm.
instead of the opposite, which actually has sort of this internal motivation for people to become better, built
Mhm.
in when you're really working with human nature as it ought to be worked with.
Right. Well, and it's not just about character and virtue, but also about function. Like, you don't
Mm,
need men to be providers when women become the
right,
providers, and women are poor substitutes for it, but
right,
still, it's when women have supplanted men in function, you also don't need men to step up to do what they were designed to do, and so it's
right.
just, the fault of not being able to find good men in many ways, probably in most ways, falls at the feet of women, and,
Yeah,
we
yeah.
really need to own up to that.
Well, and I think that's right, in terms of even looking at where the big change happened, and it certainly happened in the 60s and 70s with free love, promiscuity becoming something to which women really aspired because they thought that would make them more like men.
Mhm.
That's the big change that I think took place, and that we haven't really paid enough attention to really realizing like the incredible amount of damage that is being done by that. But the amazing thing is that women aren't generally able to be autonomous and take care of all the things that they want. It usually ends up being the state that takes over the role
Mm.
of the man. And that's the real tragedy, because that's when you're really trapped, because we become so dependent on the state. And of course, the state then has to grow larger. And then you've got men who are not responsible for anyone or anything. So yeah, it's amazing to see, it's no longer just sort of two people here. There's the state has become its own entity, such that the phrase bureaugamy is being used. Women are now married to the state and not to men.
That is such a good point, and it's not even, hidden anymore. I mean,
Mhm.
this has been an explicit goal of the government,
Mhm.
um, since, I mean, probably before Barack Obama, but Life of
Mhm.
Juliet comes to mind, of this
Right.
of this
Yeah.
idea that there's this woman who is fulfilled in every way, and she doesn't have a husband, and,
Right.
Big Brother is her husband, and he takes care of her from cradle to grave, and,
Right.
it's just so damaging, and I don't understand the allure. Like, why is
Yeah.
this
Right.
desirable for women?
Right.
Because you're not autonomous, you are not
Mhm.
self-sufficient, you're not independent, you are still cared for by
Mhm.
an abusive husband because the state
Yes.
the state will never love you back.
It will never love you back as much as you give to it. And I think that's a really fundamental point, though, is that women's vulnerability hasn't gone away. It's just been masked, or somehow we've been fed a line about it that it's not true, or somehow we don't believe that we're vulnerable, even though we're still married to the state. That it's this
Mhm.
incredible amount of confusion about it. And then if you look at the flip side, though, what happens when you have men who provide and protect and understand their role as husbands and fathers, and it's in that space that suddenly a woman's vulnerability is no longer liability. It's actually an asset, because that's when she really is allowed to become the person that she's meant to be, which is a life giver. Women are meant to
Mm.
be life givers, whether we're biological mothers or spiritual mothers. All of these different aspects in which women mother others. When you are cared for and protected and loved, then suddenly all of that can bloom in this incredibly beautiful and fruitful way in our lives, where children are know that they're loved and can grow up to be the children that they're meant to be, instead of
Mhm.
passed around from organization to organization or person to person. And then the marriage itself obviously becomes stronger as well. So
Mhm.
I think that it's exciting to start thinking about how do we as conservatives start creating better models of what is available to us when we actually
Mhm.
follow human nature and really understand the complementarity of male and female, and
Mhm.
then the incredible gifts that men have, and then what women have. And even that baseline idea, like when you tell a woman that she's a mother and she understands that to a core, even if she has no children, we see it certainly in little girls, this innate desire to mother. And we help her do that in a way that's ordered and not driven by her emotions or her ego or whatnot. suddenly she can do amazing things no matter where she's at. If she's in the workplace, or if she really is, she does have her
Mhm.
own children, or if she ends up, working in a job that requires her to be really compassionate, um, then she looks like a much different person, and she can really get through life in a different way instead of always searching for something. It becomes about her becoming more of who she's meant to be, instead of grasping at things that
Mhm.
are supposed to just be pleasurable or tantalizing, or the next adventure, or the next wardrobe, or whatnot. There's a real core and a depth there, and I think that's what we're missing today in the idea of really of good woman, is that core of what it means to take care and love and treasure, and be loyal to others.
That's such an important point. I've been thinking a lot about this idea of misplaced mothering because
Mm,
this desire
mhm.
to mother is inherent in women, even if we
Yeah,
do fight against our biology.
right.
But I've been thinking about it a lot, and now that we've been talking about the state and kind of being married to the state, it strikes me that it's not just a one way relationship there either, where the state becomes the husband for the woman, but also it in many ways becomes her the object of her mothering, where we see this a lot with progressive political activism, where
Mhm.
women will murder their own children in the womb, but then use their mothering instinct to go protest for children in another country that they don't know
Mhm.
and will never meet. And I think of
Mhm.
the lies from the media about the 5-year-old used as bait by ICE or
Right,
whatnot, and the
right.
number of women who came out of the woodwork to mother this boy in the
Yeah,
sense of caring for him and advocating for his rights and all these things. It's like these are all instincts that are good, but they should
mhm.
be channeled toward your own children. And
Right.
I mean, then you run into all kinds of media propaganda. I mean, there's many elements of this that have nothing to do with feminism specifically, but it
Mhm.
just strikes me that it's actually a circular relationship where you care for the state cares for the woman, and then the woman will use her mothering instinct
Oh,
to
that's
sort
such.
of facilitate more of this from the
Yeah,
state. And
right.
it's so crazy. You cannot deny this biological urge to mother.
Mhm.
And um
Mhm.
I had a really awesome conversation last week with Chloe Cole on the podcast.
Mm, mhm.
She fell for the trans lie as a child, and was living as a man, quote unquote, for a while, and has detransitioned. And she talks about how one of the things that kind of snapped her back to reality was being in class and learning about pregnancy and breastfeeding, and it's striking her that, like, I'm never going to get to do this, but she's wired to do this and she wants to do this. And how
Mm.
powerful, just that, like, women can spend their whole lives fighting against this urge, but it's still there.
Yeah.
And maybe it manifests in ugly ways, but it doesn't go away just because you fall for abortion and all these other
Right.
anti-woman, anti-life things. The
Yeah.
urge to mother is still present.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important, and, obviously, the pet craze has been a huge avenue through which
Yes.
women are still mothering, now that, especially now that you see dogs and strollers, and, it's just amazing how far it's gone. But yeah, it is that misplaced compassion, that idea of the woman who works for PETA, but she's aborted her own child. And I think,
Yes.
one of the ways that I've started talking about it and thinking about it, specifically, is just to really, ask that question, like, how local is your love, or the people that you love? Can you touch them? Can you see them? Can they see your face? Because that's really where women excel, and, are so gifted, because we're so embodied to be a sense of home for others. Certainly in a very real sense, as far as having a child, it's, a woman is the first home for every human. And then, it only it extends out of there in terms of the amount of time that you just spend holding a baby, looking at a baby, holding your children, looking, being dialed into them in a very real and rich way. And instead, we've said, oh, that's not really that important. You need to be, off doing big things, saving the universe, or saving the
Right.
world by, doing something with people that you have, you probably never even meet. So I think
Yes.
you're exactly right about that real inversion that's happening, and continues to happen, and be sold to us as a
Hmm.
good.
Hmm. Let's go back to the 3 commandments of feminism, because one thing in the book that really struck me that I've been kind of noodling on is how these 3 commandments of feminism, which I think you said are promiscuity, um what is it, autonomy, and the occult, is that correct?
Promiscuity, contempt for men, and the
Oh,
occult.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, and how they directly attack the Trinity, which is especially interesting in light of the Unitarian beliefs of the early
Right.
feminists. But can you
Yeah.
kind of explain how each of these commandments does directly attack the three persons of the Trinity?
Yeah, so this was a fascinating insight that I actually got from my husband because he was trying to find a quick way for me to describe all of this because it comes up over and over and over again. And again, it comes from Percy Shelley in the early 1800s. Um, yeah, when obviously, if you have contempt for men, it's going to be very hard to have a direct relationship with God the Father,
Mhm.
because you're not going to trust men. The second part would be promiscuity. Well, if you're promiscuous, you're not honoring your body, which is the temple of the Holy Spirit. And then the third way would be obviously the occult, which is really a violation of the authority of Christ as King and Savior of the world.
Mhm.
Instead, you're really buying into something that is supposed to be, at odds with his power and his kingdom. So I think it's fascinating to see like that those are the three things because they make it incredibly difficult to then reestablish a relationship with God because the fact that you've gone after these very specific ways, that we're embodied souls that are able to be in relationship with the Trinity.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think it's really it's kind of devastating when you start seeing just the how targeted Christianity has been by the feminists from in that very the mechanics, not just the general idea, but in the very mechanics of what it means to believe in the Trinity.
Yes. Can you explain a little bit more about the occult aspect of this?
Mm,
Because,
mhm.
um, if my Instagram is any indication, there are a lot of self-described feminist Christian women who
Mhm.
are not, blatantly into this witchy occult stuff. They're
Right,
just posting girl empowerment, memes and
right,
think that their career is more fulfilling than motherhood. And then,
mhm,
by all accounts, it stops there. So
yeah,
what would you say to women who maybe would self-identify as both feminists and Christians who say, "Yeah,
yeah,
I this doesn't apply to me because I'm not
mhm,
into tarot cards and I don't do
right,
palm
yeah,
readings and I don't dabble in anything of the
yeah,
occult."
yeah, well, I mean, I think that you can sort of bracket out the occult in a certain respect because I think there are so many women that do believe that, and actually that was one of the things, um, that, I've tried to tone down discussion of that, certainly in the last book, The End of Woman, because I just thought this isn't really as important as these other philosophical ideas, the way
Mhm,
in which we've been brainwashed. And this is why in The End of Woman too, I talk a lot about the communist connection, and this idea of the prioritization of work. And so I think that's actually the bigger piece is, Betty Friedan, we know there's a ton of documentation. There's actually a book written by her friend, David Horowitz, I think is his name, about Betty Friedan and her connection with communism and this idea of getting women out of the home to do productive work because the communists had decided that motherhood was not productive work. So she uses all these really amazing psychological tactics, things like, women's fear of missing out. And, again, the denigration of the home. She calls it the comfortable concentration camp.
mhm,
So she's trying to denigrate that to get women out into the workforce so that to promote the communist revolution. So I think this is, the problem isn't so much for Christians necessarily on the occult level. It is exactly what you described. It's on the work level and this level of autonomy and the prioritization of work over the much more important elements of faith and family. So I think that's that. So for the woman that you've just described, that's really the key issue. Because in a certain respect, it's bought in sort of through the back door communist principles, which are obviously not in any way congruent with Christianity either. This idea of constantly, um, even that language of empowerment, that sort of implies that women were not in power and gets back to that language of victimhood or victimization where women are automatically victims because we're female and men are the victimizers, the oppressors because they're male, which is absolutely the language of Marx that's been twisted through critical theory and whatnot. So I think there's a lot more going on than people realize that it's,
mhm.
that it's kind of language that's very loaded with a lot of communist and Marxist concepts that we sort of buy into at our peril. And I think that's really what we're seeing. So many of the problems in the culture today is because we've become very communist by focusing on work and the denigration of the home. And we've really allowed this to proliferate because we don't understand the importance of the home.
Mhm.
So I think that's hopefully that speaks a little bit more directly to that. And, aside from the occult, like even if you're not involved with the occult, if you're still involved in this language where women are victims and therefore entitled to something, and men are therefore oppressors and not entitled to something, this is where you get into DEI and all kinds of issues about merit and the way in which you structure society such that the family can fundamentally flourish instead of what we're seeing today.
Right, right. Yeah, well, and I guess, even if you're not into astrology or even if you're not practicing any of these, woohoo kind of out there things,
Yeah,
occult things, um, you can't get away from the origins of feminism being rooted in the
yeah,
occult. And you
exactly.
also it makes me think of the garden again. Like,
Mhm.
when Adam and Eve sin and after the fall, they're told, or Eve is told, your desire will be for your husband and he will rule over you. And just this sort of friction between the sexes and like the way that women try to dominate men and try to take over men's roles. And I mean,
Yeah.
that's been ongoing since the
Mhm.
garden.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's a sin, and so in that way, it is demonic. I mean, it's from the
Mhm.
enemy, it's not
Right.
Christian, and so even if it's
No, and
not
I think
occult, it's still demonic.
that's such a great point too. And I think that whole element really, I mean, feminism fundamentally is based on power and control.
Mhm,
And so if there's a situation where a woman, fundamentally will says, I will not serve, even though we know that God has set up the hierarchy, set up the whole Christian order in a certain respect. No, this isn't tyranny. This isn't some sort of like men have authority. Every man who has authority over every woman.
mhm,
There's a after 2,000 years, we have a very beautiful understanding of what this means and this
mhm,
order that God has created. And I think that that's one of the things that gets so tiresome is just sort of the sense of like, okay, this is not what I have to explain over and over again what I don't mean. I don't mean that men are tyrants and, on and on. So I think
right,
that that's really where we have a lot of work to do is just in terms of helping people understand the subtlety of it. And also the fear that women have in terms of first of all, recognizing um, that we're not meant to be just like another mother to our husbands, that
mm,
there's a real order there. And I think that, one of the things that I think is incredibly attractive in men, and having been around a lot of seminarians and men who are going to be priests, you always see there's women around them. And some of it's because they're comfortable with them, but there's also this element of there's something very attractive about men who really want to hear God's heart. They really are men after pursuing with making every sacrifice to really know what God wants. And I think that that's an important thing that we have to communicate to men and to women too. Is just that understanding of we've got to stop fudging this and allowing women just to take over because it's a lot easier to do that than to fight, and vice versa. That we have to start really holding people accountable for what it is that their responsibilities are, and for women to stop taking over what men are meant to do, and vice versa. We don't The
mhm,
last thing we need are submissive men. So I think that even having further conversations about this can be incredibly helpful and fruitful, even just in our daily lives with friends, and Bible studies, and looking at the way other people have lived this well can be really instructive and help us sort of fill out that moral imagination of how this is supposed to look, instead of always defaulting back into this, oh, she's a doormat, or she's the empowered overlord of a woman. We have
right.
there's a lot more beauty and nuance in the middle of that I think we need to start looking at more carefully, and with a lot more precision.
Mhm. I think your most recent answer kind of gets to this, but how do you think that feminism specifically has harmed Christian marriages?
Mm.
And maybe sort of a sister question to that is how can husbands um help their wives not to fall into the traps of feminism, because
Mhm.
even women who are married can
Yeah.
so often get sucked into these algorithms or sucked into group
Mhm.
chats or wine mom culture or whatever it is, where it's it's the norm to gossip about your husband, and it's the norm to tell
Mhm.
each other that you can have it all. And
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much bad messaging that
Yeah.
comes from woman to woman,
Yeah.
and even to married women who have children. So not
Mhm.
only how has feminism harmed Christian marriages, but also how can husbands help their wives not to be swept into this, short of telling them to, encouraging them to log off and get off
Yeah.
social media, because I think that's a start. But how else?
Yeah, no, that's really huge. I mean, I think part of that is just first really understanding just how manipulated we are on an emotional level and bombarded by this kind of content all the time.
Hmm.
So being really picky about who it is that you follow, what it is that you watch, how you spend your time, that's one
Yes.
thing. Obviously, filling up, having a regular regime of prayer and of silence. I think those are incredibly important, and really understanding just how to kind of process your emotions, like especially when you feel provoked and angry about something. Like, okay, what's really behind that? Where's that coming from?
Mm.
Is that the voice of God? Learning how to discern, those are really important things. And I think women, we need to get back to this place where where we become steady. There's something so compelling about women that are steady under pressure, or they're steady under, when the gossip starts. There's something really powerful about the woman that doesn't say anything. um so that is the other piece, is really understanding female steadiness. We have an attraction to the vice of both envy and distraction. And that
Mm.
means that the opposing virtue is, um, not envy, not comparing ourselves to others, but
Mhm.
also being able to sort of be peaceful in the midst of turmoil.
Mhm.
So I think that those are important pieces. Obviously, our husbands can help us dramatically in terms of, couples praying together, families praying together, reading the Bible together, making your life focused more around Christ, and what we know builds up culture. Um, and just having frank conversations. One of the things that I know as a woman that I've really come um, to value is, do people know that they can disagree with me? And this is something that I cannot say in every area of my life I'm good at this yet. I'm still working on this, a lot, because I think all of us are really recovering feminists in so many
Mhm.
respects, because it's been so ingrained in us. But I think that's an important thing too, is, do I have the humility to listen and to let other people express their views and take them on and change, accordingly. So that's important. And then I think, more than anything, though, it goes back to that idea of what's local. Loving what is local, loving your colleagues the best you can, being present to them, meeting their needs, loving your children, loving your spouse, prioritizing those needs. And, it's amazing how even countercultural it is to say we should really prioritize the needs of our husbands.
Mm.
And yet, what could be more basic? Who's closer to you? And even just recognizing what happens when we love others better, they're able to love us better. And just that, the goodness that then kind of springs, the fruit that springs from that, is really important too. So
Mhm.
anyway, I could probably keep talking about this in terms of specifics, but I think, um, these aren't hard things. It's just a matter of kind of unplugging from what it is that we've grown used to, and really recognizing the way those things are manipulating us and using us for ends that are not at all Christian.
Yes. Yes. I'm sure there's a lot of overlap here, but just a slightly different angle on kind of the same question. Let's
Mhm.
say there's a woman listening to this who is thinking, I'm a Christian and I would have identified as a feminist, but I'm tracking with you. I'm seeing that this is not really compatible. What are some concrete steps that she can take to exit this
Yeah.
sort of, because it's feminism truly is like the water that women swim
Yep.
in. It's
Mhm.
so pervasive. It colors everything. So what are
Yeah.
some concrete steps women can take to sort of deprogram their minds or retrain their
Mhm.
minds, taking every thought captive to obey Christ, to
Yeah.
to get away from these practices that are inherently anti-man, anti-God, whatever, and to really like get back and be informed in their womanhood by a biblical worldview.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I do in the book, and of course, my first suggestion is read the book, but Something Wicked. But one of the things I do in the book is look at really the role of men in a positive way. I think this is something that's been completely absent. Our commercials are devaluing men, denigrating men, making them
Mhm.
look like idiots. TV shows, on and on. But really, to start seeing what it is, what is the value that comes with a patriarchy and hierarchy. And one of the things that's amazing is just to see like the way the military functions. And
Mm.
we value this in corporate America because women are in that hierarchy, so we understand how it works. And in the military, obviously, but if you can just see the way that um, men mobilizing and moving out in smaller groups, but every man in that group has an important role to play. And I think this is one of the best gifts that men have, the women don't always have, is that they don't toss people aside in those dynamics, because they realize everybody has something to contribute. So
Mm.
understanding that's important. Understanding even the role that men play in society, like every matriarchy that has ever existed ends up being ghettoized and losing its wealth, because men and fathers are the ones who are like they're the guardians of like a hydraulic dam. They hold in the gifts of the children until the children are ready to use those gifts, like their
Mm.
sexuality, or they're the ones that are saying, okay, it's time for you to leave the nest. You're ready. Especially sons, showing them, there were all those rites of passage that used to happen, giving them responsibility, giving them experiences where they could actually fail, that they had to rise to the occasion to succeed in. So I think, aside from the things that I've already said about social media and our emotions, I think the biggest thing is to really start seeing, because the patriarchy is very invisible in our culture. We don't value it until things go wrong,
Mm.
or until, my own case, when we had an addition built on our home, and I was like, it's all men here. Where are all the women who are doing the roof? And I think they showed up when they did the painting, and then when they cleaned up at the end, but otherwise it was all men pouring the concrete and whatnot. Um, so I think that could be really worthwhile thing to do. And, the other thing too is really understand the way in which men love women. This is something I've never been able to do well, because it requires, I could probably do it with poetry, but I think, when the way men talk about women when they don't know that they're listening, for example, poetry or music lyrics, you get a real sense, I think, of what it is that men value about women.
Mm.
And it's usually not because she's bossy, nagging, and, in a pantsuit. Like, there's something much more tender and frail. And there's something
Mm.
about the way in which women feel, like, allow men to feel that they're home and they're safe and they're cared for. Um, that those are important things, I think, for us to realize, that instead of sort of feeling like we need to check these boxes of, um, our own prowess and skill set, we need to really look at what is it that we are, how is it that we're receiving others around us, and being in relationship in a healthy way with the men in our lives. I think that's another important aspect of it.
Yes, that's such a good point about the music and the poetry, and just that men and women's differences is actually what makes things work.
Yeah,
I think the platitude, diversity is our strength, is such garbage until it comes to until it
right.
comes to marriage, and then I think sometimes that's exactly right. That's what makes things work, is that we're different.
Yeah.
So everybody should read Carrie's new book, Something Wicked. You can get it on Amazon, but Carrie, I imagine there are better places people could buy it. Where can they buy it?
Yeah, if people want a signed copy, you can get it at my own website, theologyofhome.com, or the publisher, sophiainstitute.org, is Sophia Institute Press is the publisher. So
Great. And
that's
where can people follow you? Where can they find you?
best place is Instagram, or theologyofhome.com, and I also have my own website, carriegress.com.
Awesome. Carrie, I had such an awesome time talking to you. Thank you for writing this book. Thank you for making time to chat with me about it. I'm so excited for all the people who are going to buy the book now, because they will get to hear all the great messaging as well. So thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode of the Kylee Cast. If you haven't done so already, please like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a 5-star review. And of course, go pick up a copy of Carrie's new book, Something Wicked: Why Feminism Can't Be Fused with Christianity. It's such an excellent read. It's a resource I will definitely be returning to time and time again. I will be back next week with more. So until then, just remember, the truth hurts, but it won't kill ya.